Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church, and we're still in Acts, and we're looking at Acts 18 verses 1 through 11 today. And this is Paul meeting Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth. And so it's 11 verses, and I'm going to read this real quick, and then we'll get into the notes. It says, "Then Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he became acquainted with a Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently arrived from Italy with his wife Priscilla. They had left Italy when Claudius Caesar deported all Jews from Rome. Paul lived and worked with them, for they were tent makers just as he was. Each Sabbath found Paul at the synagogue trying to convince the Jews and Greeks alike. And after Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul spent all his time preaching the word. He testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed and insulted him, Paul shook the dust from his clothes and said, 'Your blood is upon your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will preach to the Gentiles.' Then he left and went to the home of Titus Justus, a Gentile who worshiped God and lived next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, and everyone in his household believed in the Lord. Many others in Corinth also heard Paul, became believers, and were baptized. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision and told him, 'Don't be afraid, speak out, don't be silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack or harm you, for many people in the city belong to me.' So Paul stayed there for the next year and a half, teaching the word of God." And so we see that Paul spent 18 months teaching in Corinth. And first he went in the synagogue, and then next door uh, in the in the house of Titus Justus. And so it's that same pattern that we've seen before. And so, just to give you an idea, Athens and Corinth were major cities in this area. It's the region, the southern portion of the Greek peninsula. In Roman times, like Greek political power, it resided in Corinth, that we see here. And this was a prominent city state and major commercial city. Corinth was notorious, and we're gonna look. When we look at the letters to the Corinthians, right, First and Second Corinthians, there was a lot of things that man, it was a messed up church. Well, we'll just say that, and we'll look at that. But Corinth was notorious for prostitution, immorality, and drunkenness, and Paul has to address these things inside the church in his letters to Corinth. And so Paul invested much time and effort establishing a Christian community in Corinth. And so he had Aquila and Priscilla here, and that became an outstanding husband and wife team in the early church. And so we see them, they're introduced here. Paul meets them, they're tent makers, like as we're going to look at that a little bit. But they were kicked out of the area that they lived in. It was the edict of Claudius Caesar that he had deported all Jews from Rome around 49 AD. And this is actually mentioned by the Roman historian, I think it's Suetonius is how you say his name, in the life of Claudius 25. So you see some parallels here between something that's written about in the New Testament and something that actually happened in real history. So again, some extra or external proofs, sorry, from outside the Bible. And so they learn their living as tent makers or leather workers. Sometimes some people say, or some translations say, and as did Paul. Paul did the same way, and so he probably lived and worked with them during his year and a half in Corinth. And you can see some things, some references in Romans and First Corinthians that we'll see that point to that. And so there's a phrase in here that mentions just as he was. And so Paul, if you know Paul's history, and we've talked about this, well, he was raised up to be a rabbi and to be, a great Jewish leader. So why would he be a tent maker? Well, it was Jewish custom to provide sons with a manual trade, right, including young men who intended to become rabbis or other professionals. It was still tradition to teach them a manual trade, so they had something to fall back on. Makes sense, right? I think it's something that we should probably look at today, is having something to fall back on when you're studying something that may not work through. And so Paul used his ability for tent making, it looks like tent making / leather working, to be able to support himself. And we're going to look at that some as well. And so once again, like I mentioned earlier, we see Paul, he followed the customs of preaching to the Jews first. And he would do that. He would preach to the Jew first and then reaching out to the Gentiles afterwards. But he just continued to meet rejection and opposition from the Jews. So he mentions, "I'm just preaching to the Gentiles from now on." We'll look at that and see how that plays out. And so the other thing that we see is that Paul probably wrote his letters. It mentions that Timothy and Silas come and visit, and Paul probably wrote his letters to the theologian Christians during this time. We're getting ready to dive into those and look at those. We're going to see it. And so this is probably when he wrote his letters, First and Second Thessalonians, to the Thessalonians during that time, after Paul or after Silas and Timothy came down and visited. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the letters and why he wrote them. And then it talks about Titus Justus, or Titus the Just. It would have been mentioned. He was a Gentile who worshiped God. And because Titus was a common name, Justus differentiates, almost like, we have our last names, and a lot of times our last names were based on our trade, Smith, those type of things. They had a similar thing they would do it, and so Justus would differentiate him from the other well-known Titus that we know, which worked with Paul, who was a co-worker of Paul, where we get the book of Titus from, and so we'll look at that later on too. And so Paul had experienced and was experiencing real opposition in Corinth, and apparently was afraid of being attacked. So the divine message was to comfort him. So this dream that he had, this message from God, he was obviously had been attacked. Paul had been attacked many times already, and looks like he was again fearful of being attacked this time. But this time God reaches out to him and says, "Don't fear it, don't worry about it. I'm going to protect you." And this has encouraged him to persist in his public ministry, and with the promise of God's protection. And so, like I said, earlier, this kind of stops in the book of Acts. We were trying to follow this as close to chronological order as we can. And so what we see is Paul had to leave Thessalonica and is now in Corinth. But now Timothy and Silas come and join him, and so then they bring reports from that area. And so now Paul's going to write back to Thessalonia, man, I can't speak to this. First and Second Thessalonians, right? To the Thessalonians, right? He's going to do that and write to them. And so we're going to now, since this is when we believe he wrote those letters, this is when we're going to get into this and start looking at this. And so, as always, I appreciate everyone who takes time to watch these. I know, like I said, a lot of these have been shorter. Yesterday's was longer. It just depends on what we hit and where we go into. Yesterday's will be a little bit shorter. It's just an introduction into Thessalonians and what it's about. But as always, I appreciate everyone takes time to watch. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please go ahead and do so. If you haven't shared these, share them with people if they're helpful. That way we continue to grow and continue to reach out to everyone and meet them. As always, appreciate everyone for watching.